August 15th, 1944. Deep inside a German command bunker, a map officer stares at the situation board for France. Blue pins mark American positions based on yesterday's intelligence reports. Third Army was at Le Mans, but new reports arriving now say Patton's tanks are at Argentan, 70 miles northeast, in one day. The officer checks the reports again. They can't be right. No army moves that fast. He marks the new position anyway, then watches as additional reports come in placing Third Army units at Chartres, Dreux, and Orléans, all simultaneously, all impossibly far from yesterday's locations. He turns to his commanding officer with words that will be repeated throughout German headquarters for the next 9 months. Herr Oberst, we've lost Patton on the maps. We don't know where he is anymore. For the first time in modern warfare, an entire army was moving faster than enemy intelligence could track it. This is what the officers tasked with plotting Patton's movement said when the pins on their maps became meaningless. German military cartography in World War II was meticulous and sophisticated. Map officers at OKW, Army Group Headquarters, and field commands maintained detailed situation maps updated multiple times daily, based on intelligence reports from reconnaissance aircraft, radio intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and frontline observations. These maps were essential tools for commanders making operational decisions about where to position forces, when to launch counterattacks, and how to allocate scarce resources. The system worked adequately when front lines were relatively static or when enemy advances followed predictable patterns that allowed German intelligence to project future positions based on current locations and estimated movement rates. If an Allied division was identified at location A on Monday, German map officers could reasonably estimate it would reach location B by Wednesday, based on road networks, terrain, and historical movement rates for divisions of that type. Commanders planning defensive operations could use these projections to position forces where they'd be needed. Third Army's breakout from Normandy in early August 1944 destroyed the assumptions underlying this system. Patton's divisions didn't advance at predictable rates along predictable routes. They moved in multiple directions simultaneously, bypassed German strongpoints rather than reducing them, and covered distances in single days that German planning doctrine said should require 3 or 4 days. Map officers receiving intelligence reports about Third Army positions found themselves plotting locations that made no tactical sense based on where those same units had been hours or days earlier. The professional frustration among German map officers was profound and documented in their daily logs and situation reports that survived the war. These were trained officers who understood operational planning and map reading. They knew that military units had movement rates constrained by logistics, terrain, and the need to maintain formation integrity. Yet they were receiving reports about Third Army that violated these constraints. Reports claiming American armor had covered 60 or 70 miles in a single day, while simultaneously engaging German forces, securing flanks, and maintaining supply lines. Initially, some map officers suspected the intelligence reports were simply wrong. Perhaps the units identified as elements of Third Army were actually different American formations. Perhaps German reconnaissance had misidentified locations or confused road networks. Perhaps prisoners being interrogated were providing deliberately false information to mislead German planning. Map officers would request confirmation of reported positions, cross-reference reports from multiple sources, and sometimes simply refuse to update maps based on intelligence they considered unreliable. But as August progressed and more reports accumulated from independent sources, German map officers had to accept that Third Army genuinely was moving at rates their doctrine said were impossible. The units weren't being misidentified. Signals intelligence confirmed Third Army radio traffic originating from the locations reported. The positions weren't being confused. Aerial reconnaissance photographed American vehicles with unit markings matching intelligence assessments. The pattern was consistent and undeniable. Patton's forces were advancing faster than German map systems could accommodate. This created a cascading problem throughout German command structure. Commanders making decisions based on situation maps that were 12 or 24 hours out of date were positioning forces to defend against threats that had already moved beyond those positions. Counterattacks were planned against American units that were no longer where maps showed them. Resources were allocated to sectors where the threat had disappeared, while actual American advances occurred in areas German planning hadn't identified as threatened. The map officers themselves became sources of bad news that commanders didn't want to hear. When a general planning a counterattack would ask where specific American units were located, The honest answer increasingly became some variation of, "We don't know with certainty." This was unacceptable in German military culture that prized precision and certainty. Commanders couldn't plan operations based on, "We think the Americans might be somewhere in this general area." They needed specific locations, force strengths, and directional vectors, but providing that specificity for Third Army was becoming impossible. What German map officers said to each other, away from senior commanders, was even more revealing. They acknowledged that the maps had become fiction, useful for giving commanders something to look at during briefings, but bearing increasingly tenuous relationship to actual battlefield reality. They discussed how to represent this uncertainty visually without admitting they'd lost track of enemy forces, settling on things like using larger symbols to indicate "somewhere in this region," rather than precise positions, or adding question marks to unit designations, or simply leaving large areas blank rather than plotting positions they couldn't confirm. Intelligence reports flowing into German headquarters during Third Army's August advance created cognitive dissonance among map officers trying to maintain accurate situation maps. The reports themselves were often individually credible. They came from trained observers, used proper military terminology, and described tactically plausible situations. But when these reports were plotted on maps showing the previous day's intelligence, the combined picture made no operational sense. A typical example from mid-August: morning reconnaissance reported American armor at Le Mans. Afternoon signals intelligence placed the same unit's radio traffic near Alençon, 40 miles northeast. Evening prisoner interrogations identified soldiers from those divisions captured near Argentan, another 30 miles beyond Alençon. Map officers plotting these reports would see American units apparently covering 70 miles in a single day, a rate that doctrine said was unsustainable for mechanized forces that needed to refuel, perform maintenance, and coordinate movements. The map officers' response to such reports revealed their professional dilemma. They could plot the reports as received and present commanders with maps showing impossible movements. They could reject reports as unreliable and leave commanders operating with outdated intelligence. Or they could try to interpret the reports, making educated guesses about which information was accurate and which represented errors or deceptions. None of these options was satisfactory, and different map officers in different headquarters handled the problem differently. Some chose to plot all intelligence as received, creating maps with blue pins representing American forces, scattered across France in patterns that suggested multiple armies where only one existed, or showing the same unit simultaneously in locations dozens of miles apart. These maps were technically accurate representations of reported intelligence, but they were operationally useless for planning because commanders couldn't determine which positions were current and which were outdated or erroneous. Others tried to synthesize intelligence into coherent pictures, using professional judgment to decide which reports were most reliable and which could be discarded. This approach produced cleaner maps that suggested commanders had good intelligence picture, but it introduced subjective interpretation that might not reflect actual enemy positions. A map officer deciding that Third Army probably was at location X rather than location Y because X made more tactical sense could be wrong if Patton had chosen to do the tactically unexpected. The most conservative approach was refusing to update maps until positions could be confirmed through multiple independent sources. This maintained map integrity, but meant commanders were sometimes working with intelligence that was days old, essentially useless when the enemy was advancing dozens of miles daily. By the time positions were confirmed sufficiently to update maps, those positions were already outdated. What made the situation particularly maddening for German map officers was that they understood why they were failing, but couldn't fix the problem. Third Army's operational tempo simply exceeded the German intelligence cycle. The time required to collect information from field observers, transmit it to analysis centers, evaluate and synthesize it with other intelligence, and disseminate assessed positions to map officers at various headquarters meant that even perfectly functioning intelligence would lag reality by several hours. When the enemy was moving as fast as Patton's forces, that lag made intelligence obsolete before it could be useful. Some map officers began proposing alternative approaches to representing Third Army on situation maps. One suggestion was using movement vectors showing direction and estimated speed, rather than trying to plot specific positions that would be wrong by the time commanders saw them. Another proposal was creating probability zones, showing areas where American forces were likely to be, rather than claiming certainty about specific locations. These suggestions were generally rejected by senior commanders who wanted definitive intelligence, not probabilistic assessments. The language map officers used in their daily intelligence summaries evolved to reflect their uncertainty. Early in August, summaries would state confidently that 3rd Army's 4th Armored Division is located at grid reference XY123456. By mid-August, the same summaries were using hedging language. Elements believed to be from 4th Armored Division were reported in the vicinity of grid reference XY123456 as of 1400 hours yesterday. By late August, some summaries simply noted that 3rd Army continues advancing at high speed. Specific unit locations cannot be confirmed with certainty. What German map officers said in their reports to commanders became increasingly pessimistic about their ability to provide actionable intelligence. One situation report from late August, captured after the war, noted, "The enemy's movement is so rapid and fluid that our intelligence apparatus cannot provide commanders with reliable information about current American positions." Maps represent estimates based on fragmentary and often outdated information, rather than confirmed enemy dispositions. This was a professional admission of failure, but also an honest assessment that the intelligence system couldn't perform its mission when faced with Patton's operational tempo. When German high command briefings for senior leadership, including sometimes the Führer himself, relied on situation maps as visual representations of battlefield realities, the map officers' growing inability to accurately plot 3rd Army positions created problems beyond operational planning. These briefings served political purposes, demonstrating that military leadership understood the situation, had plans to address threats, and maintained control over operations. Maps showing large blank spaces or question marks where American forces should be plotted undermined that narrative and raised uncomfortable questions about German military competence. Map officers preparing materials for high-level briefings faced impossible choices. They could present maps honestly showing the uncertainties in their intelligence about 3rd Army positions, which would prompt angry questions from senior leaders about why German intelligence was failing. Or they could present maps that showed more certainty than actually existed, risking that commanders would make decisions based on intelligence the map officers knew was unreliable. The political pressure to show certainty often won. Map officers would plot 3rd Army positions based on their best estimates, using symbols and formatting that suggested confidence in the intelligence even when that confidence didn't exist. Commanders seeing these maps and receiving briefings based on them might believe German intelligence had better grasp on American positions than map officers actually possessed. This created situations where operational planning proceeded based on assumptions about enemy locations that were essentially guesses disguised as certainty. When these intelligence estimates proved wrong, when counterattacks launched against supposed American positions found no enemy there, or when German forces were surprised by American advances in sectors maps showed as secure, the map officers faced criticism for intelligence failures. The criticism was sometimes deserved when map officers had failed to properly analyze available information. But often the criticism was fundamentally unfair because the underlying problem wasn't analytical failure, but the impossibility of tracking enemy moving faster than intelligence cycles could accommodate. According to accounts from surviving German staff officers, briefings about the situation in France during August 1944 sometimes became contentious when senior leaders questioned intelligence about 3rd Army. Commanders would point to maps showing American positions and ask how those forces had moved from previous locations so quickly. Map officers would explain that 3rd Army was demonstrating unprecedented operational mobility. Senior leaders would demand to know why German intelligence hadn't anticipated this, why reconnaissance hadn't provided better tracking, why the map showed such uncertainty. The map officers had no good answers to these questions because the questions reflected misunderstanding of what intelligence could realistically accomplish. German reconnaissance assets were stretched thin across multiple theaters. Allied air superiority made aerial reconnaissance dangerous and limited to brief windows when German aircraft could operate. Radio intercepts provided valuable information but couldn't always pinpoint exact locations. Prisoner interrogations were useful, but often came too late to affect operational planning. The intelligence system was functioning as well as could be expected given available resources. It simply couldn't track an enemy moving as fast as Patton's forces. What map officers couldn't say directly to senior leaders but expressed in their professional journals and post-war memoirs was that the demand for certainty about enemy positions was unrealistic, given Third Army's operational characteristics. Intelligence could provide general pictures. Third Army is advancing east. The main effort appears directed toward the Seine. Certain divisions have been identified in certain regions, but providing the specific, current, confirmed positions that commanders wanted for detailed operational planning was beyond intelligence capability when the enemy was moving too fast. The disconnect between what commanders expected from intelligence and what intelligence could deliver created recurring tensions in German headquarters throughout August and into September. Commanders planning counteroffensives wanted to know exactly where American forces were so they could position German units optimally. Map officers could provide maps showing where intelligence suggested American forces had been hours or days ago, but they couldn't provide the real-time intelligence picture commanders needed for operations against highly mobile enemy. Some map officers tried to educate commanders about these limitations, explaining why intelligence about Third Army was necessarily uncertain and why planning needed to account for that uncertainty. These educational efforts were sometimes successful with commanders who understood operational realities, but they often failed with senior leaders who viewed intelligence uncertainty as evidence of incompetence rather than reflection of enemy capabilities that exceeded German ability to track them. Throughout late 1943 and early 1944, German intelligence had tracked a formation called 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by Patton and positioned in southeastern England. This was actually Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan designed to convince Germans that the main invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The phantom fusag that existed only in German intelligence reports had helped convince German high command to keep substantial forces at Calais even after the Normandy landings. When Patton's Third Army became operational in France on August 1, 1944, German map officers faced cognitive challenge. The general they'd been tracking as commander of a massive force in England was now confirmed to command a real army in France. But the transition from phantom force to actual army created confusion in German intelligence assessments about Third Army's actual strength and capabilities. Some German intelligence officers had believed fusag in England was real, and that Third Army in France was only part of that larger force. This led to overestimation of American strength. If Third Army was just one component of Patton's command, where were the other components? Map officers plotted Third Army's confirmed positions, while also trying to account for hypothetical additional forces that didn't exist. The Phantom Army that had served its deception purpose continued to haunt German intelligence assessments, even after the real Third Army's operations made clear that no other major American forces were being held in reserve. Other German intelligence officers had concluded correctly that fusag was deception, and that Third Army represented Patton's actual command. But these officers still struggled with assessing Third Army's composition and capabilities because they'd spent months tracking a fictional force and now had to distinguish reality from deception in ongoing intelligence collection. Which reports about Third Army reflected genuine capabilities and which might be new deceptions building on fusag's success. The historical irony was that German intelligence's difficulty tracking Third Army in August and September 1944 was partly consequence of earlier Allied deception success. Germans had learned to be skeptical about intelligence regarding forces commanded by Patton because they'd been deceived about fusag. This skepticism sometimes led intelligence officers to question genuine reports about Third Army's positions and movements, assuming new deceptions when actually they were confronting reality of operational capabilities that exceeded their expectations. Map officers dealing with this confusion often expressed frustration that they were supposed to simultaneously account for Patton as threat while doubting intelligence about forces he commanded because previous intelligence had been deliberately false. The psychological burden of distinguishing genuine intelligence from possible deception while also trying to track enemy that moved faster than intelligence cycles allowed created situations where map officers simply threw up their hands and admitted they didn't know what was happening in Third Army's sector. What made this particularly difficult was that some of Patton's actual operational methods resembled deception. His willingness to bypass German strongpoints and leave them to be reduced by follow-on forces meant German intelligence sometimes received reports about American forces in locations that suggested they'd advanced through defended positions without engaging, exactly the kind of thing that might be deception rather than genuine report of real movements. Map officers had to constantly evaluate whether reports represented actual American operations, or misidentified forces, or deliberate deceptions. The convergence of genuine high operational tempo, previous deception success, and German intelligence limitations created what modern intelligence analysis would call a perfect storm of uncertainty. Map officers trying to plot Third Army on situation maps were working with information they knew was incomplete and possibly unreliable, trying to track forces they suspected might not be where reported, and attempting to distinguish reality from deception while under pressure to provide commanders with actionable intelligence for operational planning. By late September 1944, when Third Army's spectacular advance finally slowed due to fuel shortages rather than German resistance, map officers were able to assess what had actually occurred during the months when they'd lost track of Patton on their maps. The retrospective analysis was sobering and professionally humbling for German intelligence personnel who had spent careers mastering their craft, only to discover that enemy operational tempo could render their expertise largely irrelevant. The maps showing Third Army's actual movements from August through September, compiled after the fact using complete intelligence records, revealed patterns that had been invisible to map officers trying to track operations in real time. Patton's forces had indeed moved at rates that violated German planning assumptions. Single divisions had covered distances in days that German doctrine said should require weeks. The advances had occurred along multiple axes simultaneously, creating offensive breadth that should have required more forces than Third Army possessed. Most significantly, the retrospective analysis showed that German map officers' uncertainty about Third Army positions had been entirely rational given the intelligence available to them. The problem wasn't analytical failure or intelligence collection shortcomings. It was that Third Army's operational characteristics exceeded the German intelligence system's ability to provide timely, accurate positional intelligence. This was an uncomfortable conclusion because it suggested that the intelligence failures would recur whenever German forces faced similar operational tempo. What German map officers said in their post-operational assessments was that tracking Third Army had been like trying to plot a cavalry raid using intelligence systems designed for positional warfare. The techniques that worked for tracking armies that advanced methodically, consolidated gains, and operated along predictable axes simply didn't work for forces that moved as fast as Patton's divisions. German intelligence would need to develop new methods for rapid collection and dissemination if they hoped to provide commanders with useful intelligence about highly mobile operations. But developing new methods required resources, more reconnaissance aircraft, more radio intercept stations, more analysts, better communications between intelligence collectors and headquarters staff. By September 1944, Germany lacked the resources to upgrade intelligence systems, even if the doctrine existed. The Wehrmacht was fighting defensive campaigns on multiple fronts with declining capability. Improving intelligence collection about enemy operations that had already demonstrated German forces couldn't stop them even with perfect intelligence seemed pointless. The broader lesson that German military professionals drew from the experience of losing Patton on their maps was that modern mobile warfare had evolved beyond the intelligence capabilities of mid-20th century military organizations. The time required to collect, analyze, and disseminate intelligence simply couldn't keep pace with operational tempo that Patton and commanders like him could achieve with mechanized forces and aggressive leadership. This lesson would influence post-war military thinking about intelligence systems and the relationship between operational planning and intelligence support. What Hitler's map officers said when Patton's tanks simply vanished from their maps was ultimately an admission that German military intelligence, despite its sophistication and professionalism, had been defeated not by Allied deception or collection failures, but by enemy operational tempo that exceeded the system's ability to track. The maps that should have shown commanders where American forces were located instead showed blank spaces, question marks, and outdated positions that were useless for operational planning. The professional frustration map officers felt was documented in their reports and memoirs. They understood their failure but couldn't prevent it because the failure stemmed from enemy capabilities rather than German shortcomings. Intelligence systems designed for conventional warfare couldn't accommodate an enemy who fought unconventionally through speed and audacity. The maps that had been reliable tools for command decisions throughout most of the war became unreliable precisely when commanders needed them most. During rapidly developing situations where timely intelligence could mean the difference between effective defense and catastrophic defeat. The vanishing of Patton's tanks from German maps represented more than intelligence failure. It symbolized the broader breakdown of German military effectiveness when confronted with operational approaches that German doctrine hadn't prepared for. Third Army didn't defeat German forces through superior numbers or technology alone. They defeated German forces partly by moving faster than German intelligence could track and German command structure could respond to. The map officers who watched this happen understood they were witnessing something historically significant. The obsolescence of intelligence methods that had served militaries for generations, rendered suddenly inadequate by enemy who understood that speed itself could be a weapon that intelligence couldn't effectively counter.